It's my pleasure now to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Mr. Jeffrey Tumlin. He is the owner and principal of Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates, a San Francisco-based transportation planning and engineering firm that focuses on sustainable mobility. Jeff's 18-plus years of experience as a transportation planner has led him to work in cities like Portland, Oregon, Denver, Vancouver, and Washington, D.C., and Seattle. Jeff's work incorporates direct community involvement with the overarching goal of fostering economic development and improving the quality of life through smart transportation investments. He is the author of the 2012 book, Sustainable Transportation Planning. In addition, Jeff is the recipient of many awards, including ones from the Congress for the New Urbanism, the American Institute of Architects, the American Planning Association, and the American Society of Landscape Architects. Jeffrey Tumlin is widely regarded as a dynamic and knowledgeable speaker, and we're excited to welcome him to Burlington, Vermont.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here in Burlington, even though it's a little chilly outside. I have been here in the summer, and while many of my clients claim that they are indeed very, very special and unique places, Burlington truly is, and I really, really do love being here. So I was born in Los Angeles, like my parents and grandparents, and Los Angeles is a city perhaps more famed for its love of the automobile than any other city in America. And I got my driver's license on the day of my 16th birthday, saved all of my money, got my car when I was 17, and I've been driving ever since, and I really do love driving. And as a motorist, there are few things that I appreciate more than an empty parking space. But as a small business owner, and as somebody who is interested in economic development and economics in general, I also recognize that parking is expensive, and that empty parking spaces are a spectacular waste of money. I was shocked when I heard that 35% of downtown Burlington's parking spaces are empty at any given time. I don't know how many total parking spaces that is, but if you take that 35% and multiply by at least $20,000 per space, that is a lot of money that could have gone to something else, something that might have made your businesses a lot more successful than a lot of empty parking spaces that no one can find. How we regulate parking in our society is also rather complicated. In fact, I would argue that parking is the most regulated commodity in our society other than pharmaceuticals. And one of the ways that we regulate parking is we require every new development to have a certain number of parking spaces. And we typically define that in terms of spaces of parking per 1,000 square feet of development. And one of the things that we like to do to tease our clients when we first arrive in a place is to convert that into thousands of square feet of parking to thousands of square feet of development, and let cities know that if they're requiring more than 3 spaces per 1,000, they're requiring more space be set aside for the automobile than for humans and economic activity. And so, is it any wonder, as I wander around the country and look down from airplanes, that so many of our cities look like this? And this happens, it's sort of brown, so it must be California somewhere, but it could be anywhere. And this is mixed use, transit-oriented development, because in fact you can't even see it, but there's a light rail line off on the corner there, and this is what happens when you regulate parking by each land use. So you've got some employment, here's some residential, there's a hotel, here's some shopping, and for each of these land uses, the city looked up in this big book about what's the absolute maximum peak parking demand in the absolute peak hour on the week before Christmas. It's because we really want to make sure that everyone can always find a space, and God forbid anyone from one property parks in front of a land use across the street. And so the result is, if you work in that building and you want to go to lunch over here across the street, you're going to get in your car in order to drive across the street to get your lunch. If you live over there and you work over there, you work across the street from home, amazing opportunity. You may well get in your car in the morning and drive to work across the street, because minimum parking requirements and our sort of conventional myopic approach to thinking about parking creates the automobile dependency that drives us all crazy and consumes a lot of our resources. Parking also has a strong relationship with housing affordability. In addition to it being very expensive for you business owners, it's also expensive for people who live in communities. So we tend to assume, well, we're Americans, people like driving, a car is important, we all love our cars, so we better make sure that for every housing unit that is produced, that housing comes with the maximum number of parking spaces that we would expect a household to own. And that may be fine for, say, the 60% of households that do own that many motor vehicles. But for the 40% of households that happen to have fewer vehicles, why are we forcing them to spend more on housing in order to be able to have parking for cars that they don't own? Why are we making housing more expensive for people who don't drive? In fact, what we found in San Francisco is that for every parking space that we add to a residential unit, we increase the price of that unit by about 15 to 30%, and we decrease the number of units that we could build on a typical parcel by about 15 to 25%. In other words, there is no more effective tool in a city like San Francisco about dealing with our housing affordability crisis than actually reducing the number of parking spaces that we force developers to build. Developers will actually know the optimal number of parking spaces for each type of residential development. We also know from Fannie Mae that for every car that a household can get rid of, a household that can go from a 3-car family to a 2-car family or a 2-car family to a 1-car family, the savings that accrues to that family is enough for them to be able to afford an additional $100,000 in mortgage. That's how much auto ownership costs all of our families. Parking also has a strong relationship with traffic congestion. And I'm sure you guys experience this in Burlington. Almost every vibrant mixed-use downtown experiences this. People love the sort of Marilyn Monroe front door parking, and most cities kind of mismanage their parking or provide poor wayfinding. So as much as 30% of the traffic in a typical American downtown or neighborhood commercial district is simply people driving around in circles trying to find a parking space. And if you know about the laws of congestion, in the most congested system, all I need to do is get rid of 10% of the cars, and traffic flows smoothly again. If you're complaining about traffic congestion and mismanaging your parking, all that you need to do to eliminate traffic congestion is do a better job managing your parking, making it easier for people to find a space. And as Kelly told us this morning, parking is emotional. And I don't really quite understand why this is, but people are deeply passionate about parking, and part of it has to do with the strange psychology of driving. So Tom Vanderbilt, in his book Traffic, writes a lot about this, and if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to do so. He's a non-transportation planner, he's a journalist, and tried to kind of understand the weird myths and contradictions in the transportation planning and parking world. And one of the things that he discovered is something that behavioral psychologists have known for a long time, which is that we are fundamentally social primates. We take in an immense amount of information from each other at all times. Body language, gestures, the tone of voice. We're receiving huge amount of information that is assuring us of that we're safe, that we have our social status is in the right standing, that there might be some flirtation going on somewhere. We want to know about all this stuff. And when you're walking down a street in Manhattan and it's a crowded sidewalk, you don't run into people even though you're not wearing blinkers on your belt. We know how to navigate social space intuitively. But when you put us inside the steel and glass carapace of a motor vehicle and have us move forward at 65 miles an hour, we are not able to get that social information that we're used to. And so when some guy cuts you off on the highway, your social status and perhaps even your very safety is threatened. And when you don't get a sort of apologetic, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir," gesture, because you can't actually see the driver. He may be sort of frantically saying, oh my goodness, I'm terribly sorry, or may not even be aware that he cut you off. The amygdala of the brain gets triggered. Now this is the primitive sort of reptilian part of our brain that triggers the fight or flight response. And it's designed to help us defend ourselves against saber-toothed tigers, right? So it does a couple of things. So it makes the body tense up, sends the blood to the extremities, you're ready to fight, you go into crouch position. But more importantly, it shuts down the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So the part of the brain that allows us to think through the consequences of your actions. Because when you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, the last thing you want to do is waste time thinking about the consequences of your actions. It's time to react. And so this is a fascinating topic to me, the relationship between neuroscience and transportation planning. But the short version of the story is that when we're in our cars and we're cut off from the social signals that we're typically getting in our day-to-day lives, it literally does drive us crazy. It brings us out of social space and into a primitive reptilian space that makes us angrier and causes us to do things that we would never otherwise do in our normal social lives, well, except when we're on the internet, right? But that's a whole other lecture. So what do we do? So this is a brief primer about 16 key things that any city, and particularly a vibrant downtown like Burlington, Vermont, should do in order to be smarter about parking. So, and it's in kind of a strange order. So one of the first things that we oftentimes have long conversation with cities about when we come and talk about parking, particularly in a downtown that's growing, is you're going to have concerns by the existing, particularly residents, that if we muck around with parking management or allow more development, that the rules that I've grown accustomed to as a resident are going to change, and it's going to make me not be able to find a parking space in front of my house. So you all have residential parking permits here in Burlington. You've already crossed this threshold. They are anti-market and anti-democratic and are very difficult to manage well, and yet are oftentimes a necessary first step to allow us to have a sophisticated conversation about downtown parking management in a smart way, because it provides residents with some assurance that if the crazy out-of-town parking management experts are totally wrong and everything goes terrible, that they'll have at least some protection, right? So it's something that we'll oftentimes do is say, well, if you don't have this, let's think about setting it up, and if you do, let's think about how to set it up in a way that's going to be most effective, and we'll come to that later. The next thing we start talking about is parking meters. Now, one of the things that I do love about Burlington is you have a deep appreciation of your history. And one aspect of your history that maybe it's time to let go of is your 1935 parking meters. So the parking meter was invented in Oklahoma City in 1935, and it was a brilliant invention. It was invented, in fact, one of the things that I think people forget is why we charge for parking. So some of my clients think we charge for parking just to make revenue for the evil money-grubbing city, right? Other people think we charge for parking because motorists are inherently evil because they're like the great destroyers of the environment. The reason we charge for parking is so that customers can find a parking space. The reason we charge for parking is a part of improving the customer experience. That's the very foundation of why we're here tonight this morning talking about parking. And we sometimes forget about that, in part because of the way that parking tends to be handled as a sort of revenue function. We talk a lot about the money that's coming in and think about it in pure financial terms. But I can assure you that your city is going to make far more money off of a successful commercial district than it will ever make off of parking. The reason we charge for parking is to make it easier for customers to find a space and also to be able to create sufficient parking without taxing other functions in order to build that parking. And so, how many of your businesses only accept coins for payment of whatever it is that you're selling in your business? None of them? No, really? Well, so the next place where we start, when we start talking about parking, if the reason we're charging for parking is to improve the customer experience and create a successful commercial district, then it is critically important that your parking meters accept all forms of payment that actual normal human beings have on their person. I don't have any change on me. It's illegal for me to park on street in your city. You've just said to me, we do not want you, Mr. Tumlin, as a customer. Please go on to the next town. So, fortunately, technology has evolved. And not only do parking meters take credit cards and debit cards, but their ability to do so, the price has dropped dramatically. And you don't need these sort of complicated, big, multi-space meters. The little single-space meters, they'll do that. They have a little solar panel on them. They wirelessly network with each other and send all that data, including the credit card processing, back to the little central command box, which is about this big. And not only does it make it really easy to pay, but you get an immense amount of data about who's parking and how long and so on. So critically important that your parking meter takes debit cards and credit cards. But there's another thing that I really hate about parking meters, and that is I have to guess how long I'm going to be staying for, which means one of two things. Either I guess that I'm going to be staying longer than I actually will, and I'm duped now. I've been cheated, right, by downtown Burlington. Or I come to Burlington and I'm like, wow, this is awesome. You've got these great stores. Like, I can go here and then I can go there. And now I've underestimated the amount of time that I was going to spend because your downtown is so awesome. And now what happens to me? I've been criminalized. Because that's what a parking citation is. You're telling your customers, the people whose dates have gone better than they've expected, or that ended up spending more money, that you are a criminal. The police department has come and is going to make you pay a fine. This is a terrible way of managing a customer-oriented parking system. And so another invention that has come along is pay by cell phone. So there are different apps. Some of them are easier to figure out than others. But basically, the parking meter will send you a text message and ask, hey, your meter's about to expire. Would you like some more time? And you reply, and it will automatically add more time to the meter. It's really important to make it easy to pay. And I can promise you that your complaints about, the hysteria about, oh my God, you're raising the price of parking by, 25 cents an hour, all the businesses are going to die. Those complaints will go away if you make it super easy to pay. Right now, the transactional cost, the hassle of paying, is an order of magnitude greater than the actual price of parking. People have no problem paying $3 for a cup of coffee. It's okay to charge people $1 for parking, provided you make it really easy. The other thing that technology is helping us with is when you think that it costs at least $20,000 to build a single parking space, it is always going to be cheaper for you all to use technology in order to help people find those empty parking spaces than to ever again build a new parking space. There's probably little reason for downtown Burlington to consider any new parking for quite a long time because it will always be so much cheaper to help your customers and your employees find those 35% of your spaces that are empty. Right now I can go on my cell phone and I can look at where all of the empty parking spaces are in downtown San Francisco, including every one of the on-street spaces, because there are little sensors underneath that will tell me that. And in many cities, including Santa Monica, which we'll hear from later today, have wonderful systems in their garages that direct motorists exactly to the right where there is an empty space. So there's signs outside and signs on the inside. It's great. It makes it easy. So if we accept the premise that the reason we charge for parking is to help people find a space, then that means that parking is just like any other good or commodity in our society. So we have a limited number of tools in any economy in order to balance supply and demand. You can have people pay with their money, or you can have people pay with their time. It's up to you, it's okay. So for food and clothing and housing and our utilities, we use the market in order to bring supply and demand into balance. Really the only commodity in our society that we use the Soviet communist approach for balancing supply and demand is automobile parking. I don't really know why this is. Other cities have decided that, hey, if we're going to use the market for housing and food, maybe the market might actually work for parking, in which case, then, the right price for parking, like the right price for any other good or commodity in our society, is the lowest price that brings supply and demand into balance. The right price for parking is the lowest price that achieves about a 15% availability target in every parking lot, in every parking garage, and on every block on the on-street spaces. So what does this mean? It means that the right price is going to vary by geography, where the price of parking closest to your main downtown destinations in the core of your downtown is going to be a lot higher than the spaces further away. It means that the price on street is going to be 2, 3, 4, 5 times higher than the price off street, because people actually really like parking on street and don't like going into the creepy garage. And so cities like tiny little downtown Redwood City, California, realized that parking pricing isn't a political issue. It's merely something that staff can do based upon data. And Redwood City, California said, look, we don't ever want to have a conversation at council about the price of parking because people are emotional and crazy about parking. We want an availability target. Staff, achieve a 15% availability target for us. Here's some parameters. Go for it. Don't ever come back to us again except to report that you're meeting the availability target. You can do that here as well. It also means, again, if what you're trying to achieve is an availability target, that if you've got an entertainment district like Burlington, if there are fun things to do here at night, then turning your meters off at 5 p.m. is not achieving your goal of helping your customers find a space. So little downtown Pasadena, California, decided to extend their meter hours Friday and Saturday until midnight because they had a lot of bars and restaurants. And this actually helped them to become one of the most important entertainment destinations in Los Angeles County because it was one of the few entertainment destinations where customers could actually find a space at night because the Main Street spaces were not being taken up by employees. It also means, and this is exceedingly controversial, that if parking demand is the same on Sunday as it is on Saturday, that you should also be charging for parking on Sundays. It doesn't say anywhere in Leviticus that parking needs to be free on the day of the Lord. And the reason we don't charge for parking on Sunday is because very few cities have updated their parking policies since the 1950s when stores were closed on Sundays. It's time to think about what exactly is your strategy for charging for parking. All that said, as you start having this conversation about charging for parking and the right price, many of you here in the room who are merchants, all of your customers will accuse you all of being evil, money-grubbing bastards who just want to stuff your pockets with cash. And so it's important to be very conscious about what you do with the net revenue that you're raising. And so I'm glad that you're aware of it here, like where the money is going to. The Pasadena example, they really suffered from this controversy. And so the city said, fine, we don't care. We're going to take 100% of the net revenue and give it to the downtown merchants and let them use it as mad money. They steam clean the sidewalks every night with their parking meter revenue in downtown Pasadena, which has in part also helped them become more successful. And the city has made up the difference in sales tax revenue and in commercial property revenue that they lost in the meter revenue. Other things to think about. The parking is incredibly valuable land, whether it is happening off-street in a lot or on-street on the street. And so a lot of cities, really all over the country now, are letting merchants be really flexible about what happens to the parking spaces in front of their stores. So this is called a little parklet. This happens to be a little suburban community called Mountain View, where they designed the parking lane to allow the merchants to easily commandeer the parking in front of their stores for outdoor seating. San Francisco really started this trend, and what San Francisco and New York and other cities have found is that if you allow restaurants to put outdoor seating in the parking lane, many of those restaurants, particularly in the summer, are increasing their sales by up to 30%. And not only is this benefiting the actual restaurant where the parklet is in front of, but it's benefiting the district as a whole, because nothing attracts shoppers to a shopping district more than other shoppers. And so putting people in the parking lane makes them very visible. People love this. So as you start to manage your parking as a system and really focus on the customer and focus on availability, it becomes no longer necessary to over-regulate parking from a land use perspective. Developers are actually really savvy about parking and will deliver the optimal amount of parking for their project. You don't force developers to regulate the number of bedrooms that are provided in a housing unit, or to determine exactly what are the kind of fixtures that they're going to be using in their store. You don't actually need to force them to build more parking than the market would warrant. Many cities throughout the country have either done so or in the process of simply eliminating their minimum parking requirements, because they know that they can manage the parking system to provide availability, and that they don't actually need to interfere in this aspect of the development market. Another problem with minimum parking requirements is that almost every place that I've worked that has minimum parking requirements bases those requirements on data that is dubious at best. Most simply sort of ask their neighbors what the requirements are and copies the neighbors. Others go into this giant tome of a book called Parking Generation by the Institute of Transportation Engineers that is full of data from Florida in the 1970s. And it's presented in these lovely little charts. And so here's a bunch of data points. This is fast food restaurant with drive-in window. So there's data from around the country. Yep. And they dutifully drew a line straight through here to show the relationship between the size of the fast food restaurant and the peak observed parking demand. And I don't know if you can see from the back, this is a scatter diagram of data. You could have drawn the line this way. You could do it over here. And yet, they still reported the average parking rate of 9.95 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of fast food restaurant. Not 10, 9.95. There's not even a single significant digit in this equation. And in fact, where's the R-square value? Yeah, it's right here. R-squared value 0.038. 3.8% of the observed parking demand can be attributable to an increase in square footage. The situation about parking data is crazy out there. Parking demand varies far more by specific location than it does by land use type. Throw out this data, collect your own information, but most importantly, in a place like downtown Burlington, recognize that people are coming here and doing several different things. It makes no sense in a mixed-use downtown like Burlington to specify parking requirements per specific type of land use, because people are, they come here to work and they do 3 things in their lunch break, and people come here to shop at one store and they go to 3 other stores. You don't need 3 separate parking spaces here in downtown Burlington, like in the photo that I showed you at the beginning. And even in a place like Burlington, you're going to find significant variation in even residential parking demand by location. You can go into your own census data and see that people who are living in the sort of mixed-use housing closer to your downtown most likely have fewer cars than people in the more automobile-dependent parts of your cities. So, collect your own local data. Don't copy the requirements from others. Be smart and think about whether you need minimums at all, or, as many cities are doing, recognizing that there are very few tools that we have for controlling either congestion or urban design. and that parking maximums may in fact be more useful than parking minimums. In San Francisco, the city uses maximum parking allowances as a key tool for managing housing affordability and for reducing congestion, improving urban design. Minimum parking requirements are in fact illegal as a matter of national law throughout the United Kingdom because they realize that minimum parking requirements only create social harm. Point number 10, if you're gonna have parking, design it well. You've got some okay parking facilities here in Burlington. You've also got some really, really ugly parking garages. And this is a beautiful city. There is kind of no excuse in a place like Burlington for, like, don't put up with ugly. It doesn't cost that much more to do things that are attractive, again, if the reason the parking is there is to support the vitality of this extraordinary place. Make your parking beautiful, have landscape requirements around your surface lots, and have facade requirements around your parking structures. Parking structures do not need to be ugly buildings. Be very cautious with driveways. So here's a lovely building that met its minimum parking requirement by taking the on-street spaces and converting them into off-street spaces with no net gain in the total number of parking spaces, and created a really, really hideous public realm. So be very cautious about where you allow driveways to be, how big you allow garage entries and parking lot entries to be. Very importantly, as both residential developers and commercial buildings are providing parking, require or strongly incentivize them to unbundle the price of parking from the price of housing. Do not force households to buy more parking than they need. Allow people to self-select, particularly here in the residential neighborhoods around downtown Burlington. Allow households with fewer cars to self-select into your community and afford more housing. Also allow households that have more than an average number of cars to actually be able to get parking for those cars. We assume that every single household has precisely 2.0 or 3.0 cars. Some households have 4, other households actually have 0. There may not be that many of them, but why force them to spend their money on parking that they do not need? Encourage very efficient use of parking. So if you're going to be requiring parking, at least let developers stack that parking, use mechanical lifts and so on in order to count towards the total. Valet parking, totally awesome. You can get 30% more parking spaces out of a parking lot and improve customer service at the same time. What is there not to like about that? And again, if you're having minimum parking requirements, allow your businesses to do valet and encourage universal valet throughout your downtown. Do you guys have Zipcar here in Burlington yet? You're a little small for that. Car share, you do? Oh, that's fantastic. It is very difficult to get car share in a community of this size, but you have enough vibrancy and enough of an interesting demographic base that you've been able to succeed. Car share is fantastic. Every single car share vehicle that we put out there at an American street eliminates between 5 and 25 private vehicles. It is the only tool that I've found that improves personal mobility while reducing per capita vehicle miles traveled and provides cars and reduces cars at the same time. It's crazy. Do more to encourage that. You can even go so far as in new development requiring that tenants, both employees and residents, get car share as car share membership as a benefit of either living or working there. So as you get through all of these points, then you get to circle back around and realize that maybe it's time to think about being more sophisticated about our residential parking permit districts. So as I said before, residential parking permit districts are an important foundational tool, but they come with restrictions. So according to the Supreme Court, we're allowed to either use the market or whatever tools we want in order to manage public on-street parking. But if we restrict parking to specific classes of people, you're not allowed to make money off of that. So for residential parking permits, you can't charge more for those permits than it takes to administer the program. And so one of the problems with residential permits is that they can be very helpful in controlling spillover parking demand from a commercial area or from a university into a residential neighborhood, but they're not an effective tool for dealing with situations where you've got more residential parking demand than you've got spaces available. And so long as it's cheaper to store your car on street and store your junk in your garage, then people will avoid cleaning out their junk and having a space off street or renting a storage facility. So some communities have done some interesting things. So Austin, Texas has recognized in the area around their university, in their residential parking permit district, that they had plenty of available space during the day if they controlled, kept the university students out. More than they needed. And so what they did is they allowed the neighborhood to sell their surplus daytime parking capacity, a limited amount of it, to university commuters and use the net revenue for neighborhood improvements. It's called a parking benefit district, which made a lot of sense for them. Other cities like San Francisco are considering eliminating residential parking permit districts in certain very dense neighborhoods and starting to switch towards a more market-based solution that allows, basically allows for the auction of parking permits. So they limit the number of permits that are available according to the spaces that are available. We can talk more about that later if you like. Another really great program that I like is Hoboken, New Jersey's Surrender Your Permit program, where they had residential parking permits, nobody could still find a space, and they were starting up a great car sharing program in Hoboken. So they put out a whole bunch of car share vehicles practically on every corner, and for throughout the city there in green, and for residents who got rid of their parking permit, they got 2 years of free car share membership and a $100 credit, a 6-month bus pass, bunch of discounts, and a whole array of interesting benefits to try to get people to get rid of their residential permit, either storing their car in the garage or just getting rid of their car entirely. And the result was really interesting. So a lot of people simply decided that owning a car was more hassle than it was worth. They got rid of it. And they were able to get a significant improvement in parking availability and improve mobility in their neighborhoods. So bringing this all together, and one thing that's super important for downtown Burlington to understand, is that the conventional way of managing parking results in some bad outcomes. So this is one of your highways out at the edge of town. And you've got different land uses. They're sort of edged along this ugly arterial. And I don't know what your street names are here, but you know the one that I'm talking about. And every land use has its own parking lot, and you can see that the parking lot is twice as big as the land use itself, because that's what your regulations require. And so imagine a typical trip. So you drive your daughter to school, requires a parking space, and then you got to go to work, and that requires a parking space over there, and then you've got to pick your daughter up from school and take her to soccer practice, because she can't walk across the ugly arterial. And then you go and you do some shopping, and you pick your daughter up, and off you go home. And this is sort of compressed and theoretical, but it's many people's typical daily life. And in addition to it being a lot of traffic on the ugly arterial, it's a lot of turning movements off of that arterial, which are disproportionately impacting congestion. So imagine instead of developing along your arterial, you develop as you've done in downtown Burlington, where you've got land uses arrayed along a nice grid of streets with sidewalks, and they share parking in the back, and some of that's surface, some of it's structured, but it takes up a lot less space. And then you have exactly the same trip. So you drive and you park in one of the downtown lots, and your daughter walks herself to school while you go to work, and she can now take herself to soccer practice because she doesn't have to get across the ugly arterial. You pick up some errands in your lunch break, and you meet at the car, and off you go, and you go home. And this is the exact same trip as the previous one, but profoundly different results. So half of the parking needed, or twice as much economic development activity per parking space, half of the land area, or twice as much economic development intensity, 1/4 of the arterial trips, 1/6 of the arterial turning movements, and less than 1/4 of the vehicle miles traveled. simply by arranging our land uses around the pedestrian first rather than the car, and most importantly, by sharing parking. One parking space accommodated 4 or 5 different land uses, rather than having there be 5 parking spaces, 1 for each land use. That's what you've done here in Burlington, and it is tremendously economically successful. San Francisco, California has been pulling together a lot of these concepts, in part because the Bush administration gave them $15 million federal dollars to test a lot of parking concepts. And the program is called SF Park. I would encourage you to go look at sfpark.org if you want to see a really interesting example of both how to do messaging well, as well as the results of all of these experiments. Go to the resources page and you can download all of their information. They started, of course, with using good parking meter technology, bought a ton of IPS smart meters that take credit cards, installed sensors under parking spaces in order to keep track of availability, both for understanding what was happening with the parking system, but also pushing that out to the customers. Sent that information out to citizens, so you can look on your cell phone and see where there's parking, how the price of parking varies. And what San Francisco found was that the price of parking on its primo commercial districts, 5 times the price of parking 1 block away. That was kind of the market clearing price, and that was the price that kept the customers happiest. So varied the prices by time of day, by location, by day of the week, and kept track of data, making price adjustments about every 3 to 6 months, and putting the information about those adjustments out to very concerned and watchful merchants, as well as citizens who are very emotional about parking in San Francisco. And so, lots of handy charts that are color-coded to show availability, both before and after various price adjustments. And the result has been San Francisco has been able to spread parking demand out evenly so that in the test areas, you can pretty much always find a parking space, which is freaking out San Franciscans, because none of us believed that this would have been possible, right? Another key component of it is the enforcement program. So the data has allowed enforcement to be more effective. But what do you know? Parking citation revenue has plummeted because San Francisco has made it easy to pay. And the result of that is happier customers, but net revenue that is up only a tiny, tiny amount. And so while the price of metered parking on the main streets has gone way up, the price of metered parking on the side streets has gone down a little bit, and the price of parking in most of the garages has gone down substantially. And so the net revenue is really inconsequential when you look at both meter and enforcement combined. Yeah, so that's the difference. Here's the current expected. You can see that the top of the line is almost exactly the same, but the proportion of meter revenue to citation revenue very different. So again, sfpark.org, resources, lots of interesting material there. And of course, if you want any more information about parking and a variety of other interesting transportation topics, please do feel free to look in my book.